May I speak to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Today we are observing the feast of St. Matthew the Evangelist. Now, we don't actually know a whole lot about him, other than he had been a tax collector at the time that Jesus called him into ministry. He only gets a handful of direct mentions in the Bible, and other than his moment of calling, his name appears 4 or 5 times as just one on the list of the 12 disciples. That said, Matthew grabs our attention because of his work as a tax collector, a type of Judas, assisting the Romans in their efforts to drain dry his own people. In our gospel reading today, Jesus is having dinner with Matthew and many other tax collectors and sinners, along with the disciples. I am struck by the possibility that the men who collected taxes were outcasts, both to the Romans and to their own people. Their betrayal does not change the fact that they were Jews. And though I could be wrong, the likelihood of the Romans respecting them or calling each one of them friend seems slim. And so when invited to dine, maybe they had nowhere else to go, nowhere else to call home. Now, of course, the Pharisees show up, and as always, they're portrayed as overreactive and scandalized. They whisper to the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus overhears this and answers them directly that it is not sacrifice that he is looking for amongst people, not to punish, but that he desires that all people treat one another with mercy. Now, thinking about it, sacrifice done for the wrong reasons begins to look like a form of taxation, does it not? An economy of extraction, if the ones who are demanding it has to be done so, not from a place of hopefulness or charity or thanksgiving, but a place of just merely blindly following the law, it just becomes extractive. Not necessarily something that will bring grace to the person who has made the sacrifice. So there's some blindness in the Pharisees about what sacrifice means, just as there's blindness in the Romans about what it means to extract a tax. Mercy, though, also has a kind of blindness, but the merciful blindness is a holy one. We are called to be blind to the things that others may want to shun in another. So we have the tax collectors and the Pharisees that share this blindness with one another. And then we have the disciples of Jesus who share a kind of blindness to faults, to human frailty. And so our task, when called into discipleship, is to follow and not judge one another, and to learn that our task is to be courageously merciful to all whom we encounter. This is what it is that opens our eyes, everything that is full of truth, beauty, and goodness. Sort of holy blindness. Now, from early days, the church has been portrayed as a hospital, a place of refuge for all who find themselves in need of it. But we know that those of us who are called to serve are themselves also patients in this holy hospital, oftentimes just as much in need of healing as those we serve, even when it is not physically visible on the outside of us. We are not, though we offer service, immune to what ails us in this world. Becoming a disciple is not an insurance policy against sickness, dying, suffering. In fact, when we feel that tug of call into a discipleship as adults, we are right in the midstream of our lives. It's not as if first we went to disciple college and those at the top of the class are going to get the best disciple jobs, right? There is no like discipleship Ivy League. All of us are called out of our own various booths, right? So some of us are in like a tax collector booth and this booth and that booth. And Jesus comes into our life and just says, come on. We're not asked to first perfect ourselves for the work that is given to us to do. God equips those who are called. And all are called. And so we're called into this discipleship business as kind of broken, normal people. And so we might ask ourselves, well, how does that work? You know, like, aren't I supposed to like put on my oxygen mask first? Shouldn't I just be working on myself until I get this whole thing down, and then later I can go and do some discipleship stuff? But that's not the way it works. And sometimes on this path to our own healing is seeing our neighbor, like really seeing them with compassion and mercy, blind to what society tells us about them, blind to this idea that they are untouchable, unlovable, just unsolvable. We help them get their mask on. And in so doing, we begin to be healed. By focusing on becoming more generous, sympathetic, and loving, we find ourselves the recipient of generosity in return, sympathy in return, love in return. And that's part of our process of moving to a greater place of wellness within our own lives. You know, as we all know, the good stuff of living happens when we're not looking at it. I'm not sure where I heard this. It might be something that Father Drew and I had a conversation about. But if we want to really know what it means to be ourselves, to be the person that we are called to be, we find the answer to that when we are in community and frankly kind of forget ourselves. Because in forgetting ourselves, we find ourselves, and service, like real service, is just about the best way to do that. On this journey, we might find ourselves looking back at our own lives and even laughing at the unexpected ways in which God has transformed us from our former selves into our true selves. A couple years ago, I was having a conversation with somebody I'd gone to high school with. He had been a troublemaker, no doubt. He got me in a lot of trouble from time to time. And so we were talking about our, youthful daring do and whatever. And it came across to me that he hated his young self. And I just felt so sad for him. So when we look back at ourselves in the past and we see things that maybe we're ashamed of, whatever, let us look back on that person with love. Because the love of God was as present to you then as it is now. Let's be kind to our former selves. I think in being kind to our former selves, it makes us easier to be kind to our current selves and easier to be kind to one another. We should also sometimes laugh a little bit at that former self and at ourselves now. Who knew, we should think, that the person I was in the past would become the person I am today? And so Matthew was called by Jesus to follow him, despite Matthew's backstory. Not called to lend his expertise in the collecting of taxes. Not brought into the community of Christ because he would be extra adept at counting the coins in their common purse, or because he might have some kind of sway with the local Roman authorities. He, Matthew, a guy in a booth, was just called to follow. We all have particular gifts and talents, and they are bestowed on us by God. But they don't make us any more desirable to God than the next person over. It's easier for us to get caught up in our identification with our gifts and talents and say, let ourselves be only identified by our professions or by what we're good at. And when that happens to us, when we give in to that temptation, it can be easy to lose sight of our deeper, truer identity, which is as beloved children of God. For those of us with professions and lofty titles, it can be so hard to remember that we are more than a job title. But we can take great hope and inspiration from this guy called Matthew that God is calling through the Son to the healing path of mercy, not condemnation, to the path of peace, not idleness. And we can take hope and inspiration and have faith that what we are really called to as disciples is an active life of joy and service together in a holy and blessed community. Amen.